This is episode 9 of a series where we examine the cut content, design, and development of Forte tactics. In a previous video, I talked about a cut armored bus vehicle, but it turns out there's also an unused image that would have been used when targeting a car. This is interesting because it implies not only that there's a cut car vehicle, but also that enemies were going to use it against you, at least in multiplayer modes. All enemies in the classic games have a groin or the equivalent of one that can be targeted, and in case you're wondering, the car's groin would have been the exhaust. It's referenced again in the file that contains targeting data for creatures and has a note that mentions it hasn't been completed yet. In the Phoenix engine, each vehicle is technically its own race, and it's also mentioned in that code. I started to think that there were no images of the actual vehicle, but it turns out it was hidden in a very esoteric place, the tabletop RPG Forte Warfare. It has printable units, and all of the vehicles in the tabletop supplement appear in the final game, except for the taxi. This image implies the sprite existed at one point, but it's sadly missing from the game files now, as are all other related assets beyond the targeting image. There are already plenty of vehicles in the campaign though, so this isn't a huge loss. While alcoholic consumables returned in Tactics, alcohol addiction strangely didn't. It was implemented at one point though, as there's an unused icon and code for alcohol addiction, but it's impossible to ever attain. Consumables like beer that could cause the effect are all set to have no chance to cause addiction, and there's also no penalty for even having the addiction. Drinking alcohol does cause the drunk status effect, which reduces the character's perception by 1 for 30 minutes. Despite being a temporary condition, this was coded as an addiction in the engine. Normally, the addiction status bar only appears when you're addicted to a chem, and if you are, that particular addiction is shown beside it. The addiction status bar appears when a character is drunk and its description is set up, but the entry never appears, likely due to an oversight. The drunk condition image is a clever edit of the chem-reliant trait image, and it's a shame it never appears either. It has its own unique description, "You will be sorry tomorrow morning." The consumable item booze has an unused addiction and a unique description that can never be seen either. Time to start that 12-step plan to recovery. It's interesting they went to the trouble of setting up alcohol addiction only to later cut it, and I have to wonder if this was done to avoid censorship. Fallout 1 and 2 had various elements of addiction censored in international releases, and it's possible all of this was cut from Tactics to avoid controversy. Happy Pies are a consumable item that restores a very small amount of health. At one point, these were intended to be addictive as well, and while addicted, you would have had -1 perception and -2 intelligence. Later in development, the addiction chance for the item was lowered to 0, making the addiction impossible to obtain. Happy Pies aren't particularly useful items as is, and I suspect this was cut because it would have made them almost pointless. Tactics introduced a new chem called Muti, a powerful mutagenic compound designed to give the user abilities resembling those of a super mutant. For a short time, it increases the user's strength and endurance by 4, but also reduces their intelligence and charisma by the same amount. While other chems have unique addiction descriptions, the Muti chem strangely doesn't. A message does warn you when you've become addicted to it, but the player is confusingly given no indication that they have an addiction on the character status menu. If you happen to miss the initial addiction warning, the only way you can tell you're addicted is by noticing the negative status effects it applies, which reduces the character's radiation resistance by 20%. In Tactics, reputation represents how the player is perceived, and it affects the recruits that are available to you, the prices of items when trading, and also alters the game's ending. The icons for some of the reputation titles remain in the game files, but none of them are ever used, and the same image is always displayed regardless of your reputation. Missions and Tactics are numbered internally 1 through 26, but the 13th, 14th, 17th, and 20th missions are notably missing, and unfortunately there's no remnants of these levels in the game files. The only information we have about them comes from a post made on the Duck and Cover forums by developer Gareth Davies. The Lost Missions. Mission 13. Begin the cleanup of the remaining super mutants in the region. During the course of the mission, the player spots a wide path of destruction caused by a single behemoth bot. Help the town evacuate and destroy the robot if possible. Mission 14. Ambush a mutant invasion force in its last bid for a besieged settlement. Among ruined city blocks, the player would have to ambush waves of super mutants long enough to buy time for evacuation of a threatened town. Mission 14 was one of mine, and the tile layout was not even complete. It's bare bones and not too exciting. Basically a bunch of city blocks laid out with no attention to detail, and for the most part, empty streets and buildings. After the super mutant leader Gamoran is defeated in the final game, there are no other missions involving the super mutants, and these additional levels could have further fleshed the group out. Mission 17. Escort a Brotherhood of Steel scribe to the site of a fallen robot to gather information. The robot is seen as a deity to the Reavers who inhabit the town, and become hostile if the player is not stealthy in their approach. Mission 20. Capture a Reaver-controlled oil facility. These levels were all cut before any scripting had begun. It was obvious that we weren't going to have time to do them all, so these were the ones we cut, mostly because they weren't important to the main plotline, but also because they bore a few similarities to other levels. He then made a correction about the 17th mission. Oops, my mistake. I checked the doc and the bot worshippers are actually called the Followers of the Iron Savior, and aren't actually Reavers at all. They are a very similar foe though. Religious zealots that praise technology, which is probably another reason why it was cut, too similar to the Reavers. In a later post, he revealed more about the Reavers. From what I can infer from the docs, can't find anything really definite on the matter, they seem to be fairly localized. They were founded by raiders who stumbled upon a military cache and took some of the same ideals as the Brotherhood of Steel to more extremist levels. It makes a lot of sense that one of these cut levels featured the Reavers, as they're a very underdeveloped, underutilized faction. In theory, they were a fascinating group, a band of raiders who have made an entire religion based around technology and augment themselves with cybernetic enhancements. In practice, they're only present in 2 of the game's missions though. In the Junction City mission, they're powerful enough to nearly conquer a major settlement, but in their next mission, they've nearly been destroyed by the Calculator. After being rescued, the Reavers are put into Brotherhood internment camps and are never mentioned again afterwards. Scribe Highland even mentions that the Brotherhood has had many casualties in the war against the Reavers, but they're an insignificant threat in the final release. These extra missions would have made the campaign more coherent, and they're easily some of the game's most devastating cut content. In his last post on this thread, Gareth Davey stated there were plans to include detailed information about the game's cut content in a supplement to the Fallout Bible, and it's genuinely too bad this never happened either. There's a list in the item text file that reads, "The following are cool items we should consider doing." None of these appear, but there are returning items from earlier entries like mirrored shades, the Gek, dice, bottle caps, etc. All of these entries seem to have been directly copied from Fallout 2's item description file, and only one of them has been altered, the Fallout Brotherhood of Steel hint book. This is an homage to the Fallout 2 hint book, a post-game reward that maxes out your skills and stats. Well, actually due to a bug it doesn't max out your stats, but it was intended to. Its description is the same in Tactics. Well, this would have been good to have at the beginning of the goddamn game. Apart from the hint book, the other items likely would have had no effect on gameplay, but I definitely appreciate that they wanted to include as many links to earlier games as possible. The 2 most interesting items on this list are robot parts and decomposing body, both of which were going to appear in Fallout 2 but were eventually cut. It seems Tactics developers were apparently unaware that these items never actually appeared. As its name implies, robot parts were a pile of damaged robot parts, and I'm guessing they would have been dropped by destroyed Mr. Handies, Robo-Brains, etc. This shouldn't be confused with the robot part item, that toaster sex toy I mentioned in in another episode. The decomposing body item was some kind of mysterious Shi experiment and seems to be part of a cut quest. There's an unused sprite and its item description reads, "This is a partially decomposed body of a humanoid creature." Despite being cut, it's still referenced in the Xeno terminal entry found when speaking to the Shi Emperor. The subject on which we had hoped to establish a series of meaningful experiments has disappeared, presumed either destroyed or stolen by the hubologist. Further inquiries have proven fruitless. Until such time as further specimens are obtained, this database will remain inoperative. The cut sprite suggests the body was stolen and not destroyed though, and presumably the player had to recover it from the hubologist and then return it to the Shi. Regardless, these cut items from Fallout 2 would have been really confusing in tactics, and this is a case of cut content being a good thing. Some of these changes, particularly additional single-player missions, would have made Fallout Tactics into an even better game. Ultimately though, all of this was left on the cutting room floor.